one of the favorite tropes for horror books and films who really want to question the mob, the lack of individualism, and the rampaging virus. In the earliest incarnations to the latest renditions in The Walking Dead, zombies have become a mainstay in horror. And what's up, everyone? Welcome to my channel. My name is Marissa. If you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Also, please hit that notification bell so you can get notified whenever I put out new videos. So, today's monster, dun, 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 the classic zombie. And you know, I kind of hate to say it because I am definitely a vampire girl. I'm not as into the zombie, but it's kind of funny because in books, the vampires are often pitted against like werewolves. But in terms of modern culture, there's a war between the vampires and the zombies in terms of what is your favorite form of the undead. And they really both represent these different fears in modern culture. These different iterations are partially derived from the medicalization of the monster narrative, or this question of whether a monster can be sympathetic. So let's get into the origins of the zombie. Okay, so the zombie is one of the few mainstays in pop culture monster narratives that doesn't actually originate from European folklore. Instead, it actually comes from Afro-Haitian religious thoughts and practices, but it does have origins all the way back to the colonial era in Central Africa. And it's considered the only modern myth by Deleuze and Guattari, who are philosophers and literary theorists. So the idea of the zombie actually started to come about in colonialism as this kind of mystification of slavery. But the Haitian zombie is not what we see in zombie movies. It's not a disfigured body devoid of its individualism, soul, and humanity. Instead, the zombie, I think is how you pronounce it, is considered a piece of the human soul that was captured after death. And it's often kept inside a bottle to help bring luck or healing, and they do have to be fed, but it's often like salt. And rum, I think. But in American film and literature, the zombie is less humanized. In fact, all of the humanity, except for like the face or parts of the face, has been removed, right? The decomposing flesh reminds us of the ugliness of death. And it's a horde that can often represent the loss of individuality and personhood in mass consumer culture. And it really speaks to the fragility of humanity despite the advanced globalized society. So the cultural fascination with the zombie isn't an awe at superhuman beauty of the undead like the vampire. Instead, it's really forcing people to face the idea of death as a rotting, cannibalistic horde. In this monster apocalypse, movies are often designed as an us versus them narrative where chaos is unleashed in an apocalyptic virus or like cataclysmic event that causes society to change rapidly. It's kind of like the ugly aspects of humanity that we are forced to look at in zombie narratives. And they don't often have supernatural attributes like the witch or like the ghost, but that is starting to change. And they are generally not represented as sexy. They have this endless hunger and they don't have any cognitive abilities, but they're also most dangerous as like an overwhelming number, right? Because as Peter Dendel states, the zombie is a human stripped of humanity. So they really show how easy it is for the body, the city, the country, the world, how easily it can be invaded, changed, and upended. So in terms of monstrosity, they are most fearful when they are I think they're most fearful when they're specifically about the body or the horror of the body. And it's not just this like overwhelming Western fear of aging and death, but the idea of living in a body that has been dying. It's a body that has been mutilated. And it's kind of funny because the inciting event for most of these stories is some kind of medical or scientific outbreak, which I always think is kind of funny because of the advancements in medicine that are often representations of this fear of decay, right? Like Botox and, everything we do to try and keep us young. However, zombies and the outbreak of zombie virus or whatever often symbolizes the rupture of civilization as we know it and the complete loss of individual hopes, fears, desires, and even self-preservation. There's this inability for us to have a conversation with the zombie. And I say us as if I've faced one, right? But I mean the character's inability to have a conversation, or the inability to try and reason with, really prevents any sympathy with the zombie, and that makes him frightening in a way that's super unique. Because unlike the ghost or the vampire, which kind of represent a more repressed violence or a threat of violence, or a violence that's kind of been buried and is coming back, the zombies pose a very, very violent physical threat to the characters. It's a question of survival, not just like healing or seduction. So the question of the ghost narrative, if the question of the ghost narrative is a question about whether the characters are able to heal the trauma, the question of the zombie narrative is one about whether the characters are able to escape the chaotic world and return to one or create one that practices social contracts. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's get into that a little. Because why do I bring up social contracts? Now, if you remember from your philosophy classes, Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century philosopher who really became famous for his theories on the social contract, which is essentially creating a political principle or ideologies, and they kind of create these defining rights, duties, and rules that we have towards each other. And originally he claimed it was the only like a kind of unspoken agreement between the ruler and the ruled. So he claimed that the ruler would protect the ruled, and the ruled would then owe the ruler obeisance and obedience. He believed that individuals would essentially become really terrible without social contracts, that they would become, these are his words, I pulled these from him: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I don't know what his problem is with short people, but wow, pretty rude. But so essentially, anyway, he believed that people would become lawless and care only about themselves, and it would be every man as an enemy to every man. So that's kind of the image of the apocalypse, right? At least the way it's coded in film and literature. That without this kind of proper social contracts in place, it would become a very dog-eat-dog world. And it's as though this never-ending hunger of capitalism, well, anyway, we're not there yet. So the reason why the social contract is important is for the main character. Generally, the survivors are able to create a structure of trust, because sometimes threats come from other groups of survivors as well, kind of like in The Walking Dead. And the characters that survive are the ones who are able to find others, establish new social contracts, and create a place of stability where they can rely on the other characters without the presence of like a civil governance. So the fear also stems from the zombies' ability to completely remove individuality. Even if a character is able to recognize another that has been turned, there's essentially nothing of that person left. The individual thoughts, feelings, hopes, desires, and fears are completely erased. Siblings no longer recognize siblings, friends can't recognize friends, and sometimes they will even eat them, depending on the movie. But the name of the old person doesn't even hold. They could call out the name and the zombie won't recognize it. Calling out to the zombie doesn't do anything except bring attention to them and have them come eat your face. And so, of course, another metaphor of the zombie is the other side of capitalism. So when you have the vampire representing a kind of aristocratic consumer who is able to essentially establish a ton of capital due to an advanced age. I mean, think about being able to hold Google from the very beginning, right? So they have these certain investments from hundreds of years. Sounds pretty good. And they are kind of enjoying the fruits of capitalism without seeing the underbelly. Now, the zombies are the underbelly of capitalism, or at least they can be interpreted that way. And they are interpreted that way in a lot of academic research. So instead of just being incredible consumers, the zombie is only a drive, right? It's a simple drive, a simple hunger that can never be fully satisfied. It's an unending hunger that doesn't care about relationships, doesn't care about neighbors, doesn't care about friends, doesn't care about strangers. It's just this overwhelming hunger, this desire to keep feeding. So there's obviously never a sense of satiety or fullness. There's never a sense of thriving because it's really hard to thrive as a corpse. But it's encoding this fear of a disorder that comes from consuming everything in sight. And it's interesting too because although there are like 1,000 of origins for whatever causes the zombie outbreak, including, I mean, there's so many: magic, radiation, disease. A lot of zombies are produced through world corporations. Like Resident Evil has the Umbrella Corporation. 28 Days was a zombie apocalypse that was caused by a corporation doing animal testing. And the result is the same. It creates a monster that can only consume and make other consumers. Crazy. Good theory, right? It is interesting to also see the way the zombie narrative has evolved, right? It's no longer just an abject corpse or death infecting life, as Julia Kristeva calls it. But because we now start to see the same thing happening to zombies, at least in some films, that started happening to vampires. They're becoming less monstrous and more human. They're becoming sentient again, or they start to blend the line of monstrosity. So this is where the characters retain a sense of individuality, or they kind of like learn to manage their hunger in ethical ways, like eating the brains of those that are already dead and trying not to create more zombies and managing their cravings. And that's a lot like how the vampires started to drink blood from blood banks to ease their hunger and their thirst. So some also start to regain their individuality and become less monstrous. They don't have mindless consumption. They're starting to be sympathetic as a victim forced into being a zombie. And the first one I remember was Warm Bodies, where it was kind of this love restoring humanity to the zombie. But then now you also have the development of iZombie and Santa Clarita Diet, which is kind of interesting because you start to see the zombie moralizing this place where the monster isn't really a monster anymore, but an individual. And it becomes something that can still deal out life or death, right? Both iZombie and Santa Clarita Diet, which it's interesting that both of those characters are women, are reintroduced to the social contracts. They stop. So in these shows, the zombie isn't really a monster anymore, but an individual or kind of this archangel that can still deal out life or death. Both iZombie and Santa Clarita Diet have the zombie reinforcing social contracts, killing those who break the social mores of the time. iZombie is this crime drama show that shows a zombie Olivia using her consumption as a way to solve crimes. eating brains in order to get memories from the victims to help bring justice. In Santa Clarita Diet, Sheila decides it's okay to eat people as long as they're bad. So, becoming more human again. So it's really starting to question monstrosity. I mean, they're both still eating people, and Sheila is actively killing people. But instead, that kind of consuming monstrosity is going to creatures like the Demogorgon in Stranger Things, and the fear of the apocalypse is really starting to get tied up with alien movies again, like A Quiet Place and Bird Box, and other like sense-based horror. Let me know, what do you all think? Is the zombie a good horror monster still, or has the cultural moment passed when The Walking Dead peaked? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you soon.